Hello, my name is Jacob Williams. I'm the head of domestic policy at Pickthall House, and I'm here with Fez Ahmed, our head of foreign policy. Pickthall House is a UK-based think tank that specializes in finding pragmatic, workable policy solutions to the challenges of rising diversity and pluralism at home and our increasingly multipolar global order. We're delighted to be joined today with the economist and author Philip Pilkington, an experienced macroeconomist and investment professional. His 2016 The Reformation in Economics argued that mainstream neoclassical economics often exhibits a faith in market equilibria that's driven more by ideology than by scientific rigor. And since then, Dr. Pilkington has written for a range of publications, including Unheard, The Guardian, The Critic, as well as hosting the popular Multipolarity podcast, which documents the rise of a global order less dominated by the West rather than divided between multiple competing centers of power. And his new book, The Collapse of Global Liberalism, which is released in the UK on the 30th of May 2025 with Policy Press, explores the collapse of Western liberal hegemony in global geopolitics and the rise and resilience of non-liberal powers, including China and Russia, as well as the failures of what he calls hyper-liberalism in domestic policy. Our focus today is going to be principally on the geopolitical issues raised by the book. So, to begin with, if you could, Philip, for our viewers, summarize the main geopolitical thesis of the book and how you see global politics developing over the next few years as we go deeper into this multipolar world.
Yeah, well, so the book's a little bit broader than just the multipolarity topic, I think. It became clear to me shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that something big was changing in the world. Not so much that something big was changing, just that trends that had been set in motion probably 30 years beforehand or something like that were being massively accelerated. And we started the podcast on the back of that, and I kind of made it my main focus of writing. I'm currently working in foreign affairs now, and all that kind of thing. So I became very focused on that issue. I think some of us, some people were saying we were talking rubbish at the time. This was back 22, 23. I think we've been pretty much vindicated. I think we can do a victory lap on that one. But the book is about something a little bit broader because prior to being interested in the accelerated developments in multipolarity, if you want to put it that way, sounds a little bit economic, academic, jargonistic, but what can we do? But in addition to that, there was clearly a big movement taking place in the United States, which I know you're interested in, and in Britain too, about about a move away from liberalism or a move beyond liberalism, sometimes often called post-liberalism and that sort of thing. And I was involved in that, probably going back to the first Trump election. I wrote a lot with the Journal American Affairs. I was quite close to a lot of people in that world that were trying to develop those ideas. And of course, I sympathized with them massively. And it seems to me, I guess the thesis of the book is that the emerging multipolar world order is actually the beginning of the collapse of global liberalism itself, and really the collapse of liberalism. And that's a massive claim. I mean, that's a bigger claim, really, than Fukuyama was making in the 90s. Um, because he was saying, okay, everything's now static and we're going to live in this permanently liberal world. And that's a pretty big claim. Wrong, I think. But brave. But this is, I think, a more controversial claim because the liberal project is half a millennia old, not half a century. It's half a millennia old. I basically date it to John Locke's two treatises on government. If you want the first political development, it's probably the English Civil War. But we don't have to have the historical debates. It's about 500 years old, this development, and it seems to me that it's buckling under pressure now. Those pressures are coming from a few places. Obviously, the multipolar developments are absolutely key, because, as you said in the introduction, non-liberal or illiberal powers, not post-liberal mainly, although I'd say Russia is post-liberal because they went through a very liberal phase. You could maybe argue Iran is post-liberal too, given the fact that they went through a liberal phase in the 20th century, but and maybe Turkey, but mostly, for the most part, illiberal. I don't think India was ever liberal. I don't think China was ever liberal, for example. So this is putting pressure from the global direction on the Western liberal countries, but internally, the liberalism itself seems to be collapsing. what you referred to there as hyperliberalism. I say in the book this kind of kicked in the early 1990s, basically when Fukuyama said the end of history, and these liberal trends that were nascent in the society, they were there for a very long time, about 500 years, but they'd been contained by non-liberal forces in society. And by that I really mean structures that were handed over basically from the Christian tradition in the West, family structures, communal structures, taboos on certain things, not just sexual taboos, taboos on certain types of economic activity, everything, all these things that held society in check that were there at every point of liberal development. 1776 in America, they were there all throughout the 19th century in Britain, and so on. And they kind of kept the forces in check. That all came undone in really, I'd say, in the 2010s. But, the seeds were definitely laid at the beginning of the 1990s. And I think at that point, it became increasingly clear that liberalism was not a viable system for running a society. And that's effectively where the post-liberal critique started to come in. I'd say, again, 2010s probably, although, you can go back to McIntyre and so on, and you can say that these things were there for quite a long time. They were also there for a long time in the Marxian tradition, which is a wholly different thing, which I think is an interesting subplot in the history. But basically, that's the basic overarching idea. Liberalism's collapsing at home, and the global liberal order that we tried to really establish with gusto post the Cold War, but it's set in place in probably 1946 as well, is now kind of collapsing, really. I mean, it's falling apart. So liberalism is crumbling at multiple levels. And it's funny, I will say, it's funny how these things work. If you're religious or something like that, then like you can say, okay, well, there's a teleology to history and there's a reason that everything collapses at the same time. If you're not, it must be very shocking that the two things have just kind of imploded at once. There are relationships between the collapse of the global liberal order and the collapse of domestic liberalism, but it's not a necessary connection. So it's a fascinating moment, really.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. How would you kind of characterize the Trump presidency as a sort of harbinger of the collapse of liberalism? There are kind of obvious things that people would point to that sees Trump as a real departure from traditional American sort of liberal order. Let's say, for example, on the economic side, tariffs, the kind of reversal of the glut of dollars that we have in the world and trying to turn America into a sort of export surplus economy. And then just the kind of transactional nature of his relationships with other powers that are not predicated on a shared liberal ethic, but more sort of realpolitik.
Well, okay, so we have to take a few things here. First of all, the first Trump administration was a massive surprise. Historians will no doubt try and read something into it. Maybe there's some logic to that. But really, it was just a massive surprise. Now, the one thing that you can read into the first Trump presidency is that there was a lot of discontent in America. Basically, discontent that the American empire wasn't working anymore. People came to realize that in the Obama administration. Obama himself, by the way, had some sympathies in this direction, we must not forget. Strangely, and conservatives will kill me for this, but the Obama administration had some post-liberal tendencies in it of their own, at least globally. And the right wingers would say it was all weak and mushy and all that. Well, it's playing out pretty tidily today. And I saw that Obama met Trump, and there's rumors of a tete-a-tete. I'm not surprised by any of that, to be honest. But anyway, so the Trump phenomenon you have to look at from a couple of different perspectives. So the first of them is that it definitely signaled that the empire wasn't working. The global liberal empire wasn't working, centered around America, with Britain as a minority partner, and increasingly minority as time went on. That wasn't working. That wasn't working for America, and that's why they voted for Trump. Does the average MAGA person understand that? Actually, yeah, better than people think, to be honest. Americans didn't care about foreign policy until about 4 years ago, and they started caring about it because they started to link the two things. Because people aren't stupid, and they at a certain point they begin to see that something's wrong on the global stage and it's connected to the domestic stage. So that's the first thing. Second thing is Trump's character himself. Is Trump a post-liberal? No, I don't think so. I think Trump's a businessman. I don't think he's particularly intellectual, but I think he's got ideas of his own that were not liberal. And if you go back to interviews with him in the 90s or in the 1980s, by the way, he speaks in a completely different way. It's fascinating. That's a whole different discussion. But he's clearly criticizing what I'd call hyperliberalism, the complete unleashing of global free trade forces. And he's very critical of that from a very pragmatic and realist perspective. And that's basically Trump. That's Trump's entire shtick. Everything else is movable for Trump, but the things that aren't movable are the hyperliberal trade policies. And also, I think he's always been skeptical of war and global imperial ventures that don't benefit America in some sort of a transactional manner, which arguably none of them do, because it's not the 19th century anymore. Engaging in these military escapades is very, very rarely economically wise. So that's Trump himself. Now, the second Trump administration is a completely different beast, because there's been an influx of post-liberal intellectuals into the movement, mainly centered around J.D. Vance. That does not mean that J.D. Vance is a separate power center in the administration. He is not. I can tell you that for a fact. He is not, and he has no aspirations to do that, because doing that will be political suicide. Well, first of all, I think he's pretty loyal to Trump. Second of all, it will be political suicide. Trump is absolutely loved by his base. And he will be, no matter what he does. He famously said, "I could shoot someone in Times Square and they'd still love me." It is true. But JD Vance has become the kind of rallying point for the explicitly post-liberal forces within the administration, which are growing by the day. There's more and more hires. I hear a lot about the hires in certain circles, would you believe? And there's more and more people flowing in there by the day. But I think what we're coming up against right now is basically that I wrote my book a little bit too late, because the post-liberal movement up until now has been a very philosophically and even theologically ordered movement. It's gone a lot into kind of high theory, very similar to what you'd see in actually left-wing circles, kind of Marxian, analysis, critical analysis, that sort of thing. And as in Marxian circles, it hasn't been great on cookshops for the future, as Marx said. It hasn't been a very good a template for governing. And what the liberals did very successfully, not initially, I would say, not initially, although John Locke's ideas on the structure of government are interesting, but I think over time they developed at least a nominally credible governance structure about free contracts, free trade. We could go into all the parts to the liberal apparatus. The post-liberals were a little late in coming to the table with that. In fact, I don't think they have a coherent social policy vision, because it's mainly been a philosophical project. And so what's happening now is they're trying to work that vision out in real time. And it's trial by fire. But I think the instincts are there. And I think they'll take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that's what we're seeing with the tariff policies and so on, which frankly were never realistic. But that's what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. And so it's learning by doing. I'm not saying that there's no policy work out there. American Affairs has done a fantastic job putting together policy work in various different disparate directions. But there's no coherent vision of where a post-liberal society should go. But it is developing, and it will develop. And even if the Trump administration fails catastrophically, which it might, it won't make any difference. Liberalism is intellectually discredited, and all the energy is on the post-liberal right. And if Trump is a massive failure, the post-liberals won't take it as, "Oh, well, that didn't work." They'll take it as, "Should do better next time."
So it's very interesting you mentioned sort of early nascent post-liberal tendencies, at least in the global sphere, even under the Obama administration, because one of the quite surprising but very powerfully argued claims you make in the book is that this conventional assumption that the US still has military superiority is based on assuming that military spending is a good proxy for actual capability. But you argue this is false. Could you explain why for our viewers? I think it'd be fascinating to learn.
Yeah, this is a disastrous misinterpretation of military. It goes back to the creation of macroeconomics itself. It goes back to the First World War. Macroeconomics, we won't go into the detailed history, was born effectively out of the First World War, when Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and other economists saw that you could actually manage economy on a macro basis, as it were. They were doing that crudely in World War I, badly. There was a lot of inflation in World War I. It was complete chaos. But they retooled the entire society around arms production. Much as they did in World War II. We tend to think today of World War II as the great kind of reorganization of society along economic military lines. But actually, it happened in World War I. World War II, it was a lot more planned because they've been thinking about it. And basically, the national accounts themselves came out of this, and counter-depressionary strategies, demand management, and so on, really were born out of World War I, the experiences of World War I. Remember, Keynes worked in the Treasury financing the First World War. People forget this. He was a Treasury. He was a senior civil servant financing the First World War. All of those ideas came from that. And many of them did. I'd imagine if you look at Mikhail Kalecki or any of these other guys, you'll see that they were involved in war planning in some shape or form. So the modern warfare became associated with macroeconomics in the Second World War, theoretically, and through the national accounts. And that's where the conflation came to be made, that you could manage a war along economic lines. Now, maybe you can, maybe, if you're in total war. If your economy is completely geared toward war and your GDP accounts are basically tracking the amount of armaments that are being popped out the other end, then in theory, GDP is a good proxy for war fighting. But apart from that, you're engaged in an absolute fantasy. It's absolutely meaningless because it's not a market structure. The military-industrial complex is not a market structure. There is no market signal to say that the F-35 is a good plane. There is no market signal to say that you should prioritize aircraft over missiles. Okay, so there is absolutely no check and balance in the military-industrial complex to make sure that it's doing what it should be doing. And what we've also learned very recently is that the only check and balance on that is testing this stuff in real time. And actually, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I would argue all throughout the Cold War, the military powers, but especially the capitalist military powers, were extremely cautious about testing the military equipment for the simple reason that if it failed the test, a lot of money would be lost. The Soviet Union were less concerned about testing the stuff because they saw it as an opportunity to test the gear. Whereas because we have a for-profit system in the West, we were very nervous about testing the armaments. And we could go into a whole history about that, how I actually think there's credible evidence now that that the Scud missiles in the first Gulf War did actually overcome air defense, and it was covered up, just as MIT professor Ted Postol argued, and he was vigorously censored for it. He used to work, by the way, for the Department of Defense. He wasn't some crackpot on the internet. So I think basically we've been hoodwinked here a little bit. We've been told that if you spend more on military equipment, you get a better military. But it's not true. It's simply not true. And actually what the Western military-industrial complex incentivizes is massive spending on extremely big projects with high margins. Okay, let me give you a real-time example of this from the UK in the past 18 months. So when the Houthis shut down the Red Sea, which is amazing in and of itself, the strike force was being put together by the United States, and as they do, Britain said, we want to be part of this coalition of the willing, and committed, or at least said they were going to send one of their 2 aircraft carriers. Within a week, it became clear that they could not ship the aircraft carrier out of dock because they had an insufficient crew due to shortages in manpower. Okay, so what happened there? Well, we don't know the full details, and we never will know the full details. It's probably top secret, classified, whatever. But really what's going on there is that there's a lot of money in maintaining an aircraft carrier, not just in building one, although there's a ton of money in building one, but there's a lot of money in maintenance and so on. Getting those contracts is profitable. There's not a lot of money in maintaining a crew. That's the reality. And so the incentives are structured in such a way that the spending goes on big ticket, sexed up projects that look cool and that you know, this FAFO kind of memes online. And then it's like, well, do we have a sufficient crew? And it's like, well, who cares about that? Like the government organized that. We don't have private contracts for that. We don't want private contracts for that because it's not worthwhile. And so you can go down the list. I mean, that's just an example of the kind of Soviet tier dysfunction that this system creates. But you can also talk about the relative the relative merits of weapon systems, which we're learning a lot about at the moment. The fact of the matter is that a Russian tank, a T-72 or something, that's been used in Ukraine right now is a lot, significantly cheaper than a Challenger 2 British tank or an Abrams tank from the United States. And let's say that it's half the price, okay? It's really hard to cost a T-72, especially now that they've engaged in mass war production. But let's say for the sake of argument, it's about half the price. It's probably less than that, but let's say it's half the price. Can an Abrams or a Challenger kill 2 T-72s? Because if they can't, then they can't justify the ticket price. Well, I'll tell you they can't, because even when you look at the supporters and detractors of various tanks, who, by the way, have no idea what they're talking about. It's like listening to people talk about football matches down at the pub, to be frank. But if you look at what they're saying, they're always arguing within a margin of like 10 to 20%. Oh, it's 10% better. It's 15% better. It's all this notion of optimization. And it's like, no, you can't justify the ticket price unless it can kill two T-72s. Oh, well, it can't kill 272s. That's crazy, right? So that's the issue here. And you can go down the list on this. You can say aircraft, for example, fixed-wing manned aircraft are really, really expensive. Missiles, ballistic missiles, like the ones Iran are using, are really cheap. So are the fixed-wing aircraft that much better? No one makes the case. At least, I mean, they're starting to now because it's becoming so obvious that much of this technology is outdated. If it were ever in date, by the way, again, it was never really tried. So it's a fascinating moment in that regard too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of brings us quite nicely onto what was what you mentioned earlier as a sort of watershed moment for recognition of the sort of post-liberal world order and the collapse of global liberalism, which is Russia-Ukraine. Again, this seems to be a case where we've made the same assumption that if we just throw infinite money into funding Ukraine's war effort, that they can somehow overcome Russia. Could you explain why this event is so sort of indicative of future trends in weakening Western power?
I mean, you could go on about the Ukraine war. The idea, though, that equating military force with economic power, and by the way, equating economic power with money, what a strange thing to do. One of the first things that you're taught in an economics class is forget about the money. Okay, so if you go into an undergrad class, they start teaching you from a barter economy. Now, there's all debates around that. The Keynesians hate it. The Marxians are a bit nervous about abstracting from the money and everything like that. Okay, that's a whole macroeconomic debate, whatever. But the fact of the matter is, when most people go and they do a PPE course at Oxford or Cambridge or whatever in the UK, or they do the equivalent at Harvard, Kennedy Business School, whatever, you know, these kind of train you in everything and nothing, go into government and rule the world courses, which I don't think much of, frankly. But when they do these things, look, you go into your undergrad class and they say, stop thinking in terms of money, think in terms of things. The money is just a medium of exchange. And I don't know where these guys, they come out the other end and then they're like, oh, well, we can just like create money out of nowhere. And it not only magically creates economic activity, which, but I'm a Keynesian, by the way. I don't mind fiscal demand stimulus. Supply has to be there, guys. Like, come on. So, but they've got this magic money idea into their head, not just that they can create economic wealth out of money creation, but that they can create military force out of money creation. That's a completely deranged perspective. And we're learning it every day. I saw an article last month. I'll give you an example. Last month, I think it was. This was on the Polish military spending. So the Poles were the first to the plate, right? They came out very early and they said, we're going to boost military spending massively. So the Poles have done in microcosmic form what the Germans have just announced at the European level. Massive money dump, which is going to create a military out of magic. Okay? It's going to spread the magic beans around and a military is going to grow. The Poles now are 2 years deep into this. And it's been pretty much a disaster. They've bought a load of foreign equipment and blown out their current account. Okay, that's fine. They have the foreign equipment now. Even that doesn't equate to a military, guys. So the domestic, they thought that they were going to get this big military industrial complex off the ground. The Poles do have a modest military industrial complex to build on. But they thought just by dumping money into the system, it would just spread up like mushrooms after rain. Hasn't happened. They just ended up with a load of imports, probably South Korean, some American, maybe some from Germany too, from Rheinmetall or something like that. So that's the first mistake that was made. But many mistakes have been made. I mean, Obama said when in 2014, when the Russians went into Crimea, and Obama was asked, I think in an interview, maybe it was one of those long form interviews, why aren't we doing something? And he said, for Russia, it's an existential issue. They're willing to throw a lot of bodies at this, and we're not. And that's just been the reality. That's a combination of that. Are you willing to lose, tens of thousands of people? Are you willing to accept thousands of bodies coming back? No, they're not. We're willing to accept that on the Ukrainian side, mercenary army and all that. How's that worked out historically, by the way? Can we go and look at the history of ailing powers hiring mercenary armies? Okay, let's not look into that one. But there's been so many of these things. And look, the economic one is really deeply rooted. It's clearly a bunch of people who've been taught to think in terms of PowerPoint presentations and Excel spreadsheets. And it's become really pernicious now. It's not real economics. It's not real planning. It's strange, actually. It's like money management uber alles. But beyond that, there's just a series of other more qualitative mistakes that were made, like the one that I just said. That's a quote from President Obama. And it's been all down the chain. And also, I'll tell you this as well. This is what we're coming to realize in Europe right now, that people are only beginning to wake up to what it means to actually lose a war. After this war is over, it'll become clear that a lot of what we called war probably since the end of the Second World War, but let's be generous and call Vietnam a full-scale war. Definitely since Vietnam. What we're learning is the great deal of what we call war were imperial policing operations, very similar to what the British undertook in the 19th century with their Marines and so on. I'm not diminishing anyone who fought in those wars. I'm sure it was terrible, but that is what it was. And when you lose in Iraq, it's an abstract thing. It's an abstract thing. Iran come into the power vacuum. It has some, regional dynamics, all that kind of thing. But it's very abstract, maybe for everyone except Israel. Okay, it probably actually matters for Israel directly. But for everyone else in the West, it's abstract. And what I see in Europe right now, not so much in America, but what I see in Europe among the European leaders, I think they were just in Kiev recently, is they're beginning to wake up to what it means to lose a war, to really lose a war. Because when you lose a war, things change. Elites get tossed out, et cetera, and you can kind of see that coming down. You're seeing kind of the light in the distance. That's a train coming. Like, it's a train. I'm not saying the Russians are going to invade Europe or anything. I think all that stuff's rubbish. I'm just saying that losing wars has consequences. Economies change afterwards. Elites change afterwards. Security architectures change afterwards. I mean, just to say, when the Trump administration first got in, they made indications, which I think will end up coming true, that the Americans will end up partnering with the Russians on various projects, for example, in the Arctic, maybe in Central Asia and so on. I think this will probably end up happening. And the Europeans were shocked at this. They said, but I thought you were their ally. And you almost say to somebody, pick up a history book, guys. When a major power backs a minor power in a conflict and the minor power loses, they always turn around and shake hands with the victor. But people haven't, they have the historical perspective since the collapse of the Cold War has become so poor because we've become quite a decadent society, let's be honest, that these PowerPoint merchants have just forgotten what it means to lose a war. It's like somebody who's got into a way too serious situation that they don't understand. Like some secondary school kid or something is kind of playing around, wants to be a gangster or something like that. And suddenly, like, he's in the middle of a gang war and people are taking guns out. And it's like, oh, this is real life,
So one of the other crucial events to the sort of ongoing collapse of Western liberal hegemony that you alluded to earlier is the Houthi attacks on the Red Sea shipping lane. So why is this so crucial to this ongoing collapse?
Again, I think this is a question of a surprise that's very easy to read some sort of logic into, and you do have to, in retrospect, read some logic into it. But again, I think it's a surprise. Iran backed the Houthis. They continue to back the Houthis, and they back them as part of a regional strategy to keep Israel in an unstable position, shall we say. But I think up until the war in Gaza, they saw their main proxy as still being Hezbollah in the north, and to a more limited extent, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And I think the Houthis have turned out to be a complete dark horse, because I think even the Iranians, who obviously have invested extremely heavily in missile technology, copying other countries, by the way, like China and Russia. I'm pretty sure the Iranian designs are just old Chinese designs. They've invested in that massively, and they backed the Houthis on the basis that that's what the Houthis were going to end up being useful for. Or they backed them in a land war previous to that against the Saudis, don't forget. So then they were just seen as a kind of a conventional force. And they won that war effectively against the Saudis. But what's happened here is that this small group, which people thought were quite primitive, and in a sense maybe they are, have been given these advanced but not hyper advanced missiles. I reckon, look, nobody really knows, but my guess is they're Chinese missile designs from the 1990s and early 2000s, maybe with newer targeting systems welded onto them. Probably at this stage you can buy that stuff from AliExpress. And drones, of course. Drones are very important too, but I think it's the missile technology in the Houthis case that's particularly interesting. And what the Houthis are proving in real time is two related things. First of all, they're proving that you can engage in a naval blockade without a navy. Now, some people, I said this on Navarro a couple of 2 years ago or a year and a half ago or something, and I did get pushback, and people said, well, you know, people have mined seas and stuff before, and that's true. But I think what we're seeing now is a fundamentally different phenomenon. I think this is the first land-based force that's truly been able to enact an ongoing naval blockade. You could lay a bunch of mines in the Red Sea, and then you'd clear the mines, and that would be the end of the story, right? But this is an ongoing naval blockade, which there is probably no way to break it, in a sense, without entering into some sort of a negotiation with the Houthis or with their backers or whoever controls this thing. But what it's shown as well, related to that, is that much of the naval power that the Anglo world, I'd say, is focused on, but also France. I mean, France is into this too, but mainly the Anglo world. And this goes right back to the British Empire, to the ability to control shipping lanes and so on. But this, we thought that the aircraft carrier solved the problem of naval power. Basically, the problem with naval power was that once aircraft came on the scenes, big dreadnoughts weren't very impressive anymore because aircraft could harass and destroy them and so on. And the aircraft carrier was thought to be a solution to that. And we're seeing that it probably wasn't. And in fact, it probably was never. I think this is probably another instance where the tech just never really got tried. I mean, I say in the book, and I think it's accurate, that the first anti-shipping ballistic missiles were Japanese Zeros loaded up with explosives and a suicidal pilot. And then, you know, once the missile and the missile technology to do that was already proto-developed at the end of the Second World War in the form of the V1 and V2 rocket systems, but really came into being, I'd say, you probably had credible anti-shipping missiles by the 1970s, when the aircraft carrier was supposedly reaching its kind of zenith. So I think that technology is being disproved in real time in the Red Sea. The US, in their latest venture, the Trump anti-Houthi venture, has lost 2 planes. We're not really sure how they lost them. The first one was said to have fallen off the side of the ship while they were turning, maybe to avoid a missile, we don't know. The second one, well, I'm not going to make any predictions. I'm sure it's all very classified. But I joked on Twitter that a Bermuda Triangle had opened up over the Red Sea. It could be that the Houthis are hitting these ships at this point, because again, this goes back to the economics of the case, not this nonsense GDP metric economic stuff. The basic economics of the case are that the Houthis have a potentially infinite number of anti-ship missiles, drone systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the ships have a limited battery of air defense weapons. Not only do they have a limited battery, but they're way more expensive. I think the average interceptor on those things is about $1 million. The average drone, if they're using Shaheds or something, it's like $20,000. And I don't really know how much the Iranian missiles they're using are, but I doubt they're more than 100 grand each, maybe 150 for the anti-shipping ones, not for the ballistic ones that they're currently firing into Israel, but the anti-shipping ones, I'd guess they're 100, 150 grand. So you have a 10-to-1 ratio on that. Oh, and by the way, you usually need to fire at least 2 interceptors for every missile fired just to try and get a hit. and some of them get through. So you don't even have to go into the cost. I mean, the cost of the value of the aircraft carrier itself is, I think, over 20 billion, and there's 5,000 people on board on a carrier battle group. So the economics of this just make absolutely no sense anymore. And so I think we're reverting back to we're going to a very different form of warfare, where effectively, I think, and this plays into the multipolar world, and this is actually quite, I think personally, this is quite an optimistic view, is that offensive weaponry is no longer very effective, and defensive weaponry is enormously effective. But isn't that, I don't think that's a terrible thing, because that actually means that if you, the division of a multipolar global system with countries that aren't interested in interfering too much with the rest of the world, but are interested in their own defense, have a very credible means of just sitting there, tooled up with missiles. If they're big enough, they'll have nuclear weapons. And it's like a porcupine or something, like no one will go near it. So in a sense, it could be quite optimistic, but it completely blows out of the water all these old notions that come from the British imperial days of you control the world when you control the shipping lanes. It's not happening anymore. And now that the shipping lanes have become so unpredictable, you'll see increasing use of rail and so on. Not just in Eurasia, although that's coming. The new Silk Road is coming, and the Americans aren't going to stop it. But we'll also probably see it in places like Latin America. A friend of mine, actually, I was having lunch with him. He's going off to DC at the moment, and he pointed out to me that that even the Panama Canal is completely like irrelevant now. The Trump guys are talking about the Panama Canal, but the new rapid loading AI port technology means that you can just run a railroad across, and you can just put all the stuff on, ship it up, offload in 2 hours onto the train it across much quicker, much simpler, and then take it off on the other side. The canal technology was only there because it was so difficult to load ships, but it's no longer true. So these old notions of global power that come from the British imperial era are going to have to be thrown out. And I wish I'd written about them more in the book, but these are the cores. These are the core aspects of geopolitical doctrine that you're going to be taught, Mackinder and all this stuff. It's all out of date. It's probably been out of date for a long time, actually, but it's completely out of date now. So we're going to have to update the software on a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. We touched on a few points there. I think something that's particularly relevant in terms of sort of sketching out how the sort of British professional managerial class or even the political class don't really get it is I think yesterday or the day before, Starmer mentioned in a private meeting that that the defense industry would be the engine of national revival, which is totally at odds with what we've just discussed. To what extent do you think this kind of instinct is how do you say, sort of associated with the kind of Atlanticist ideology that we have in government? Is that for a long time we've relied on this kind of relationship with the United States, which has included, for the best part of the last 2 decades, accompanying them on their sort of foreign adventures. So how has that influenced the way that we think about sort of global power?
I mean, the British case is particularly unique. The two countries, I'd say, outside of Israel in the West that are most threatened by the developments in the multipolar world, long term, don't get me wrong, are probably Britain and Ireland. They're very unique cases. And it's because they've stitched themselves so much into the American project. I won't talk about Ireland, much more simple. It's massive FDI. There's a great economist in Ireland who's come to call it the multinational potato after what happened during the famine. I think it's a good one. But look, we'll talk about Britain. Ireland's only a small country anyway. I mean, I'm Irish, so I care about it. But Britain basically, they've done what you've said. They've stitched their entire global strategy into the American global liberal strategy. And what that's done is it's meant that they haven't put behind them the "we rule the world" mindset. And that is going to create great difficulties in the future, not just in terms of retraining diplomatic corps and so on, which will have to be done. But also just the legacy of that for a very long time. I mean, Britain, given its size, given its relative power, which is not much on the world stage, let's be frank, its optimal position, if you abstract from all the other, all of what's happened historically, is basically to try and be friends with everyone. It's an island economy. It's an island economy. It basically doesn't have any threats to it at all. And so you try and be friends with everyone. You take a kind of that kind of approach. And of course, having gone along with the global liberal project, Britain's done precisely the opposite. They've taken sides in pretty much every conflict. I think they've implicitly at least taken a side in the recent India-Pakistan conflict, for example. This is not a wise strategy from Britain's perspective, unless you think that this global empire pays dividends in some way. So their geopolitical strategy, not only will it have to be entirely rewritten, which will take an awful lot of time and effort, it's going to take such a massive change of mindset, institutional mindset, and so on. Although I will say, and knowing some people who've worked for the Foreign Office, I think a lot of people there at a practical level understand this, to be honest. And they're often overridden at a political level or at an MOD level, which is a really interesting thing if you want to go into the politics in Britain. But I think, okay, so there's that. But then there's the real big problem, because that's a problem of institutional reorganization. And then you have to try and reset a load of relationships globally that, let's say, there's some hysteresis built into, would be the polite way of putting it. But the problem, the more hard problem, and I won't even come to military technology and so on, because I don't think Britain needs much of a military in the multipolar world, but whatever. But no, the real hard problem is economic, because Britain stitched itself to the American system, and it's done so in a very particular way. I'll just give a really brief rundown of what happened to Britain in the 20th century. The British economic model in the 19th century, it's very ironic. It was always said to be based on free trade. But it wasn't. It was based on free trade within the empire. It was a closed system. And it's described very well in Karl Marx's Das Kapital, where he describes cotton being taken from India, raw cotton being taken from India, being brought to Britain to process in British factories. The financing for this trade takes place in the City of London. That's effectively where the City of London comes from. And then the cotton products are sold back to Indians. They're sold domestically, but they're also sold back to Indians. And India, I think, are running a trade deficit within the empire that's being propped up effectively by lending by the British. And that system basically carries on until the interwar period, when the empire starts to collapse. Now, the issue with that is that it meant that British manufacturing, we don't really know when, but my guess is late 19th century, wasn't actually globally competitive. It was only really competitive within the imperial system. I think by the end of the 19th century, Germans probably already caught up, and Americans probably already caught up. So it's probably not competitive for a good 40 years there. And then you go into the interwar period of turmoil with the screw-ups with the gold standard, Churchill, all that. I won't go into the history too much, but that's basically the collapse of the imperial system. And in fact, really interestingly, because I was fascinated with this one, the person with the clearest view of what's happening in that period is actually Oswald Mosley, which is a very strange side note, but he's actually quite sophisticated from an economics point of view. He's good friends with John Maynard Keynes, and he talks very extensively. He criticizes Keynes for not recognizing that the imperial system is completely necessary for the functioning of the economy. And I think he actually has a stronger side in that debate, interestingly, forgotten period in history. Anyway, after the Second World War, can't afford the empire anymore, not working anyway, probably wasn't any saving it. And they hand the baton to the United States, not really understanding that they've done so until the Suez Crisis in '56, but they figure it out. And after that, sterling goes into a long period of decline. I think in 1945, sterling is worth $4.50, if my memory serves me correctly. And it goes down and down and down. And some of these are big crises, the devaluation under Wilson, 67, I think. And then there's an IMF bailout in '76. So this is a long period of decline. And what you're seeing is that manufacturing, which had been insulated from global forces for a long time, in the Second World War, it became enormous, but it was completely insulated from global forces. It was basically a closed economic system, and it was a borderline planned economy. And it unwinds completely. And I think probably at some point, maybe in the 80s, maybe in the early 90s, there was a chance for Britain to maintain a modest manufacturing sector, perhaps like a country like France or something like that. Not of the scale of Germany, but perhaps of France. But instead of that, they went with the finance model, which started in 1986 with the Big Bang under Thatcher. Had to do with high interest rates in Britain. There's a whole thing about that. But basically, what happened was almost by accident, but it then became kind of planned. Part of Wall Street landed in Britain, in the city of London, and started to prop up enormous trade deficits. And basically what happened, without going into the macroeconomics too much, but what happened was sterling became a sort of a mini dollar. It hung on to the dollar's coattails as the global reserve currency. It was never a global reserve currency, bad currency as a global reserve currency, because it kept falling in value, which is not good for a reserve currency. But because the city was able to carve out a unique space in the Wall Street model, we'll call it. I won't go into what that unique space was, but it was able to do that for a period. You were able to get sufficient financial inflows into Britain to prop up living standards and to run increasingly massive trade deficits, to the extent that they're now so large that you'd associate these with like a country that's addicted to foreign aid in Africa or something like that. Really dangerous levels of current account deficit. Even if I saw those in America, I think they peaked. I think one quarter, the peak was 6.8% of GDP, something like that. Crazy numbers. Like that's not sustainable at all. And so that's where Britain is right now. At the same time, the dollar is clearly at this point collapsing as a global reserve currency, which maybe we can talk about later because it's happening in real time since Liberation Day now, but it's been in the cards for a while now. And I think that the British model is under enormous threat. And what would that mean? Well, if the financialization Wall Street model starts to crumble, which I think it is, those deficits are going to have to close, those trade deficits. And in order to close them, the sterling is going to have to fall in value quite substantially. Exports don't really become more competitive in that environment because manufacturing has been effectively eviscerated. They do become a little bit more competitive, but to a large extent, no. We can talk about that more if you want, but it has to do with the fact that a lot of the finished products in Britain require a lot of imported inputs. And so when the currency goes down, the inputs go up and right. So you'd stitch it into global supply chains. It doesn't work like a normal currency adjustment. And so what's really happening is the imports become more expensive. And what that means is 30% of a British shopping basket, approximately, is imported. And you probably know that if you go down to your local Tesco, that stuff goes down, that stuff goes up in price. And it's just crushing on living standards. And on top of that, there's already a borderline fiscal crisis in the country. I hate to be so pessimistic, but Britain's in a terrible pickle at the end of this. Ireland is too, sadly, but yeah.
So I guess shifting focus back to the sort of US-UK relationship here. So it definitely looks as though not only is this economic situation unsustainable, but also that perhaps with the comments we've seen from Vance recently about Europe not wanting to be a permanent security vassal of the United States, does the UK and also perhaps the rest of Europe really need to be kind of dragged kicking and screaming into forming a more independent foreign policy?
Well, I mean, they will have to. I mean, it's that old, the one law in economics, as they always say, is what can't go on, won't go on. And this is a case of that. They're going to have to form some new foreign policy, the Europeans. Right now, they're mistaking that for having to form a military policy, which in my opinion won't work. Does Europe need to remilitarize? Yeah, probably. I mean, you probably want some sort of a defense capability. But that's a long-term project. And if you try and rush that, you're going to screw it up. And they're trying to rush it. So they're almost definitely going to screw it up. And we saw that in Poland already. So yeah, they probably do need to kind of build up their military forces and so on. But I always point this out, like imagine in the imagine like it's true that the Russians want to invade the whole of Europe. I don't think it's true, but let's say that it is true. By the time they get to the French, by the time they're approaching Paris, you have a nuclear exchange. So let's not forget that the French are a nuclear power. Britain's a nuclear power, although the Trident doesn't seem to be working. That's a separate issue. But the French are a nuclear power. So can anyone explain, this to me? Couldn't Germany just have some nuclear missiles if they want an effective deterrence? Nobody talks about this. The reason for that, I think, is that, look, I don't want to impugn anyone's motives, but I really, well, maybe I do. But I really do suspect that some people who are talking about the Russians turning on the rest of Europe and invading it now are being disingenuous, to be honest. And the issue here is that it has real consequences, because they're over focusing on trying to remilitarize the continent, which will not work, because that's a long-term project. That's like saying, I want to reindustrialize Britain. It's like, yeah, okay, but I want to do it in a year. Okay, well, you're not going to do it in a year. You're just going to engage in a bunch of grifting. Okay, you're going to like throw money around and people are going to steal the money. That's what's going to happen. So don't do that. Come back to me with a 20-year plan. That's what you need to reindustrialize Britain. Same for European military, just to get people back in the mindset of joining a military. I'm in Budapest at the moment, and they've been very good about maintaining their military throughout. They've hit the spending targets over and over again. Now they're trying to increase recruitment, I think, because they've realized that land forces aren't irrelevant anymore. And there's a concerted effort to they're putting out movies that advertise the attractiveness of going into the army, that it's a kind of a sexy job and like desirable and stuff. That's what you need. This is gradual. You have to change the culture among young people. You have to make sure that they're going into the military. By the way, going into the army for the right reasons. There's a lot of people in Western militaries, I'll be frank, in Europe especially, who are not there for the right reasons. They're there for free money. They're there to get a college degree. Okay, these aren't. Anyway, that's a whole different thing. But so they're over focused on this military thing, which is, as the kids say, a LARP. It's fake. And I think I'm increasingly coming to suspect that it's actually a reaction on the part of a lot of these this foreign policy establishment in Europe that's been built around NATO, that's going to lose access to funding. And I mean, I don't mean that in, oh, they're looting the place. No, I really mean it just like for their events, to keep the ship afloat, in a sense. Like there's an entire apparatus built around the security architecture in Europe that keeps a lot of people employed. And I wonder if some of this military spending isn't just being used to prop that up, but that won't last. So they're overly focused on this remilitarization question, which is a much longer term question. It's not something we need in a year. If it is something we need in a year, we're finished, okay? But I don't think it is. And they're not focusing on what you're talking about, which is absolutely possible to do, which is retool your foreign policy strategy. Pour some of that money that you're going to waste into developing like actual think tanks and stuff that are focused on European foreign policy strategy, security architecture, these kind of things. What we all wanted until 2022, which is not more war. We want to find some way of living in the world together, trading with each other, not murdering each other, not being in constant conflict, having reasonably good diplomatic relations, and so on. But my fear is that the capital right now is forming around this remilitarization strategy that's not going to work. Rather, it should be forming around a broader discussion about what this new world order means and how we're going to live in it. And the last thing I'd say about that is, people would not talk about the multipolarity issue, abstract from the liberal issue. People would not talk about the multipolarity issue at all for the past, 3 years. And they've started talking about it now, but they're trying to blame it on Trump. I saw The Economist this week had a beaten up American Eagle on it, and it said like 1,369 days left. Like as if like, oh, it's Trump's fault. Where were they in the it was the Biden administration mainly that pushed the eagle out of the nest. Let's be frank. And the Trump administration is mainly reacting and being handed a very bad set of circumstances. Not saying they're not making mistakes on their own, but that's the reality. Now, look, on the one hand, that's juvenile and it's sub-intellectual and it's annoying. But on the other hand, like, if that's the attitude people are going to have, yes, these global changes are happening, but it's because of the orange goblin. Like, that's not serious. So there needs to be like this. The thing is, this is so doable. This doesn't require getting your manufacturing back in line. It doesn't mean changing to a more martial culture. It doesn't mean finding good army recruits. Those are really complex things that'll take a long time. This wouldn't actually take a long time. It's just like, have a realistic debate about it. Stop living in fantasy world. Throw some money behind this. Realize that a lot of the mores that the boomers had just aren't going to fly anymore, and that moral condemnation of China like isn't a real foreign policy position. So look, you'll have to break a few eggs with that, like intellectually or whatever, but it's doable.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned it in the book, just on the topic of a kind of foreign policy realignment in Europe, that the sort of eastward expansion of NATO was a policy that was pursued despite, and I think the terms you use are, it was an example of a policy that could result in one's own country becoming poorer and less stable. Now, to play devil's advocate, a sort of liberal IR theorist might say to you that, the idea that we should spread liberal values or spread democracy, even leaving aside the fact that it's a sort of morally good thing to do, there's evidence to suggest that it would produce less conflict in the world, and therefore mean that we wouldn't need to pursue this sort of remilitarization strategy. What do you make of that argument?
It's been falsified. I mean, like, these big abstract arguments that aren't based on anything, I don't have much truck with to begin with, to be honest with you. It's like, well, in theory, if we just spread liberalism everywhere, why? Second World War or something. Like, that's not an argument. Like, sorry, I'm an economist. I don't like, that's like, you might as well hand me a book on French literature theory. Like, I'll read Derrida or something, like, if I want really abstract arguments like that. It's not like, I don't know what that means. It's like the Thucydides trap or whatever. It's like, what? I don't understand. It sounds like a deterministic argument about something that's really complex and historically grounded and people have a choice in, et cetera, et cetera. I don't get those kind of abstract theories. I never really have. But, to the extent that it can be falsified, it's been falsified. And by the way, it keeps being falsified. This was the same argument that they made about Iraq, and it caused complete chaos in the Middle East. But it's just so obvious, to my mind, it's just so obviously absurd. Like, it's a liberal thing. It's a highly ideological idea of mankind, which is that, just like the communists used to think, that there's a new man residing in the heart of every human being, right? And maybe even a few monkeys as well. And you can just go out and you can show them the way, and you can engage in some propaganda, and you can overthrow a bad dictator. Everyone is Hitler. Get rid of the Hitler, get rid of the little Hitler or whatever. And then, oh my God, their inner liberal will just come out. Like, this is the kind of thinking that you have to call revolutionary radical. It's the kind of thinking that you'd attribute to Jacobins, to Bolsheviks, and so on. And it's just, the liberals, I'm kind of it caused so much chaos, so I want to be careful with my words here. But I'm kind of glad that the liberals finally got to that point, because it unmasked their entire project. It was never the reasonable project that they were making it out to be. The Jacobins were the original liberals. And well, that was very radical liberalism. We're much more this and that. No, it always tends in that direction. That's what I'm arguing in the book, because it's based on an abstract tabula rasa view of man, just like communism is. And anytime you have an ideology like that, the basic idea that's driving it is, if we can just turn everybody into this new man, this liberal man, this communist man, whatever, then the world's going to reach utopia. And I've just never, of course, this comes from the Christian tradition, which is the evangelizing religion. But the Christian tradition on evangelization is completely different. You're, for example, not allowed to evangelize at the point of a gun, for one. It has to be consensual and so on. But there's also respect for other cultures. Christianity is very famous in in taking the pagan culture that they encounter and then channeling it into a local form of Christianity and so on. So the Christians are much more realistic about this, but it comes from that married to an Enlightenment idea that you can reduce people to widgets, to logical structures or something like that. And of course, this is any time a project like that is pursued, it eventually hits flesh, right? It eventually hits flesh, and you realize, oh, wait, people don't behave like the liberals say. There's innate characteristics in human beings. I personally believe in natural law theory. But even if you don't, like, I think anyone who rejects complete abstractionism will fall back on, I don't know, the common sense stuff that you'd find in Scottish Enlightenment, something like that. You can come up with many different versions of this. I think the natural law stuff is fine, but anytime you fall back on that, you realize, no, eventually your abstract ideas are going to meet flesh. And they have every single time. There's been no instance where this has been successful outside of the lines that were basically drawn in the Second World War, right? I mean, there's been none since then. So the last successful, quote unquote successful, I'd say liberal imperial or whatever you want to call it, project was Korea. And it resulted in a demilitarized zone, a highly liberal South Korea, which is collapsing under its own contradictions now with its low birth rate and various other problems, and a communist North Korea, who are weirdly, in a sense, the trad Korea, because they believe in the old Korean mythology and the main Pak-2 bloodline and so on. I talk about it in the book a little bit, this really interesting tendency of hardcore communist regimes to revert back to old monarchical local cultural systems. I think it's an absolutely fascinating phenomenon. But that was the last one. Okay, we liberalized South Korea, we liberalized Japan after 45, liberalized Europe, which was already halfway there because the ideas weren't that unusual. And then the next attempts were Iraq, disaster. Prior to that, Russia in the 1990s, basically a disaster. And now we have another one in Europe, which is going to destroy the liberal project in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like if we want Europeans to move away from this kind of tendency, you need to find a way to sort of extricate the ideology from the political structure. I mean, what really was quite indicative of just how deeply ingrained this stuff is was the Munich Security Conference, where the chair of the conference said that, you know, in response to J.D. Vance basically coming and reprimanding everyone at the conference, that he said we have to fear that our common value base is not common anymore, and concluded his speech basically literally in tears. How do you form this sort of new vision of the world when basically the entire political class is sort of so deeply sort of has this ideology so deeply embedded?
It's a tough question. I mean, look, I'll be absolutely frank here. That kind of that kind of crude ideology drummed into people, that's why they had to like engage in campaigns, shall we say, in post-war Germany and Japan. Okay. Like that's why they had to do that. When the communist regime collapsed, people were so cynical with it by the end of it that there wasn't much in the way of that left. The Brezhnev generation were the final revolutionary generation, and they were mostly dead. The Gorbachevs of the world were not of that generation, and they were cynical about the system, and so they didn't have that same buy-in. What you're dealing with in Europe especially, I don't think it's as bad in the United States, and this is because Europe became a vassal toward the end of the United States, and political officers, shall we say, rose through the ranks. But you're facing that, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't know what to do about that. How like Imperial Japan loses the war? You have a bunch of people who are convinced that the emperor is a god. Okay, they were convinced of that. I'm not using the Nazi example because it'll sound like everyone is Hitler, and I'm not trying to make that case. I'm making a structural case about politics here. Okay, so how do you convince them that he's not emperor? It's like a massive propaganda campaign for the next 20 years. And you'll still probably in the 60s find people pottering around who are like, oh, I don't really like what the newspapers are saying. I really think that the emperor is actually a god, and I was right to fight in that war, and so on. And here we're going to get the loss of a war, which is what it is. It's a major loss of a major war, not as big as World War II, but it's in the same genre. It's not in the policing genre of Iraq. And there won't be any clear drive to do that because, frankly, if the Russians win, first of all, they're not coming into Europe, in my opinion. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, but I don't think they are. And second of all, I don't think they would. I don't think they care. I don't think so. I don't think that's on the cards. Some people seem to implicitly think it's on the cards with some of the rhetoric you hear, but it's not. So we're going to be in a position in Europe where we have a bunch of people kicking around who like genuinely like believe we're one step away from winning the liberal struggle in Ukraine, and we're not. Like the war will be over. There'll be some sort of a settlement. Hopefully it won't be too bad for Ukrainians. I don't want to sound like anti-Ukraine here. I really feel bad for what those people have gone through, and I hope they get like a country worth it afterwards. I really do. It's so tragic. But you know, it will be settled, and the US will probably settle it over the Europeans' heads. I think what's going on right now is a bit of a inverse phony war. I think the Europeans are fooling themselves, thinking they have all this. Well, we're tricking them into this ceasefire. I think I know a lot of people in DC. I think they're ignoring the Europeans. I think they're ignoring the European press. Once the Russians move forward, the weapons package runs out, all this stuff, I think they're just going to go, something's going to be sorted out and it's going to be over the Europeans' heads. And then if we have all these people like pretending that there's still some path to victory when, you know, like there's a peace document on the table, like, I don't know. I don't know, because usually when this happens in human history and a war is lost, like there's a ping domestically. And we're not going to get that. So I don't know. I mean, the best, and I'm glad, I don't want Russians occupying bloody Germany and like, you know, like making everybody a Russian vassal, like 100%. Obviously, we don't want that. But it's going to be a challenge for like people who recognize that the world's going to move on from this. And the challenge is going to be kind of communicating over the, well, hopefully to those people, but over the heads of those people, maybe sometimes, and saying, look, that is not the reality of the world anymore. And unless we want to go down a very dark path, we are going to have to figure out a new way of living in the world. And by the way, this isn't just about Ukraine or about Russia or anything like that. It's also about China. A lot of anti-Chinese sentiment has been drummed up during this war. And, you know, we can talk about China. Is it a competitor? Are their EVs too cheap for European markets? Those are all perfectly reasonable questions. Do we want them in our security apparatus? All perfectly reasonable questions. But hardcore ideological hate of China, I don't think that's very productive. And it's become, you know, like some people think, oh, well, they supported Russia in the war, and to some extent they did economically and so on. So it's all of these things. And I don't know. I don't have a simple answer for it. I think it's going to be a very, very hard time for Europe. I think America is going to have a much easier time moving on from all this than Europe.
So to sort of bring things to a close then, for a country like the UK, in the medium term, looking at this economic dependency that it has with the US economy, its, so we say, institutional inertia that you've highlighted, its unwillingness to, or for large parts of the establishment, to actually even entertain the idea of developing a more independent foreign policy. What are some things that, if there were the will in a place like the UK, could actually be done in the medium term to adapt more successfully, or at least less unsuccessfully, to this emerging, less hegemonic, less Western dominated, less liberal dominated world order?
Well, I'm working pretty hard this summer on a particular proposal. It's in the book actually, but we made I put it together last year. It's been circulated with the Trump administration prior, like a long time ago. It's been on the table for a long time. Let's just put it that way. And it's for a new Bretton Woods system. It's for a new currency system along the lines of a Keynesian Bancor system. I know that might, to non-economists, that may sound like, oh, you've come up with some crackpot economic means to like solve world problems. But if you understand how pernicious these trade imbalances are and how much conflict that they can cause in the world and how much economic dislocation and so on they can cause, sorting out the global trade architecture and monetary architecture is it's I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but if you give me like one shot at the problem, that's probably the shot I'll take. And the tariffs, as of today, have failed. Nice that we did the interview today. They've literally failed today. The Americans blinked. and they pulled back. And no doubt the Trump administration will lie about that, but that's what happened. They couldn't take them, and they were facing shortages on Walmart shelves. That's what the president was told, and it's true. And so I know that the Bretton Woods proposal, new Bretton Woods proposal, which by the way was the official British proposal in Bretton Woods in 1944, because Keynes was the delegate and he put it on the table. This would be a multilateral currency system that would put rules. I won't go into the details of it, but put rules in place on global trade that would ensure chronic imbalances never became a problem again. And it would be particularly good for a country like Britain, because for Britain, devaluation, as I said, will not work in the short term. It will work in the long term. I mean, eventually people will be sufficiently poor that they'll have to make their own stuff, but it won't work in the short term. What's nice about the Bancor arrangement is if devaluations aren't working, it forces FDI into the country. So literally, just think about Britain run a trade deficit with China. Devaluations of sterling aren't closing that trade deficit, or they're closing it only on the import side, and it's overly painful, and it's judged to be overly painful. The Chinese will be forced to start building factories in Britain. Literally, that's how it would work. So it's and fine, those would be Chinese owned, but it doesn't matter. They'd be British jobs and they'd be British products. They'd be made in the UK. So just like, you know, a Toyota factory in France or whatever. So so it would solve a lot of problems. And I think the main problems we're going to face over the next 10 years, once we've put these conflicts to bed, which I think we're looking at pretty much winding them down the next couple of years, are going to be major economic problems. And, you know, the world could fall into the interwar period, and God knows what kind of political nasties come out of that. I don't think we want to see it. And other conflicts and so on. So I think my silver bullet at the moment, it's not really a silver bullet, but it's close to, is pushing for a new Bretton Woods system and trying to set up some conferences and stuff on that here and in DC and so on. So I think that's a pretty good venture, and that's pretty low-hanging fruit, because all that needs to be done is to convince the Americans and Chinese. I mean, that's the reality. It's a G2 proposal. All the other countries will fall on board, and it'll be massively in their interest to do so. I can't really think of a single country outside of America and China that would disagree with this. America, the loss is you recognize the loss of the US dollar as reserve currency. And China, you have to, over time, wind down your reliance on mercantilist surplus trade policy. So I think that's pretty low-hanging fruit. But I mean, there's so many other things. I talk about a bunch of different issues in the book that liberal societies have brought with them as massive problems. I mean, everything down to closure of psychiatric hospitals, I think, was a major mistake. It's the underlying cause of homelessness, not lack of homes. It's just even homelessness itself is kind of a weird thing to call throwing people who can't take care of themselves out of the street. Kind of a strange framing in that regard. But you know, there's a bunch of different things. We obviously need to retool our way of looking at military. I'm pretty optimistic about that long term, because I think ultimately we can spend a lot less, get a lot more, have a defense-based system, a truly defense-based system. By the way, again, for Britain, so easy. It's an island. With these new anti-shipping technologies and robust air defense systems, you know, you can defend this thing pretty easily and pretty cheaply. So there's the military aspect, there's the social and domestic aspect. I mean, the other big thing is going to be birth rates. Obviously, that's become actually quite fashionable, thank God. People have started realizing the onerous results of demographic decline. And that will require, in Britain, that will require retooling the entire welfare state, which was just set up. It was set up to do the wrong thing. It was set up, the TLDR version is, it was set up in the with Bevan after the war, and it was set up basically to provide short-term assistance in a full employment economy. You know, transition from one job to another, making sure that you don't become homeless, I suppose we'd say today. But that is not that it's not what it does anymore. Obviously, that's not what the British welfare system does anymore. It's a redistribution system. it maintains people out of work and so on. But this isn't a call to do some sort of a harsh welfare cuts or anything like that. It's much more complicated an issue than that. But we need to recognize that that actually probably the biggest social problem facing societies today is below replacement birth rates. And so what we need to do is, in Britain specifically, because they have such a large welfare system, retool that welfare system around families. That does not mean throwing the poor out in the rear. There are ways to do that without being, really harsh and neoliberal about it. But that needs to be the underlying assumption. There needs to be an underlying assumption baked into it that the social support system is based around the family. And that may even go up to aspects. I've been thinking about it recently. A friend of mine here was talking to me about the issues with pensions here in Hungary. And I realized that the pensions were even becoming a big problem, just even with a reasonable family policy in place. And then I started thinking, thankfully in Hungary, there's still a kind of a culture of taking care of your parents when they're old. It's not a care home society. And I thought, geez, you could restructure the family benefits project around that, Like young people actually do take care of their grandparents here. It's actually very charming. And I thought, geez, you could stitch the family benefits in some way and to kind of, like if you're putting in some effort into taking your elderly grandparents some cheese or something like that, like maybe you can stitch that into the benefit system or something. The logical way to do it, because I was explaining, you can't just juice up the pensions. Like we'll have to cut something else. We'll have to cut the family benefit system then, and so on. So that's a big complex system, and it means that every aspect of state assistance and state subsidy, from the pensions right down to the welfare system, right down to the income tax systems and everything like that, how we're going to run taxation policy, you're going to have to restructure the entire framework around maximizing family formation and fertility, and taking care of elderly people, unless we want to go into Soylent Green territory. I'm really actually frightened by that. It sounds flippant of me to say that, but I'm serious about that. It's scary. So I think working on these issues, there's lots to be done. I think there's so many good ideas kind of floating around in the ether right now. And we just kind of have to get to it. But right now, in Europe at least, for the next couple of years, I can't see us getting out of the way of obsessed with this conflict, militarization, all this, and we're falling behind. The Americans, for all the problems with the Trump administration, they're kind of moving the ship in the right direction. They might crash it before they get it back on course, but we'll see.
Philip,
Great,
it's been
thank you.
a fascinating, a really great discussion. Thank you so much for your time and for taking the time to speak to us and share your insights. So the book is The Collapse of Global Liberalism with Policy Press. That will be available by the time this is released, and we'll put a link where you can viewers access it. Before we finish, Philip, is there anywhere else you would suggest people go to follow your work?
No, not really. I mean, my Twitter account, but it's kind of snarky. If you like snarky Twitter accounts, you can follow the snarky Twitter account. Where I'm doing stuff with the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs at the moment. I think we're putting out some pretty interesting papers from time to time. The Bretton Woods proposal was originally published by them. So there's some interesting stuff coming out of that. I'm trying to think of anything else. Not really. The podcast, Multipolarity, the podcast. Like and subscribe, share it with your family, whatever. I'll do the podcast dance. But yeah, in general, the book. I think the book's kind of a comprehensive document. I'm hoping it kind of penetrates or whatever. It's got some good endorsements so far, and the reviews are lining up. So I'm quite excited for release day, for Liberation Day, come May 31st or whatever it is.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again, and thanks everyone for watching. We're going to conclude there.